Before it became the reason you're functional before 9 a.m., before it lined the pockets of colonial powers, before it launched 1,000 Pinterest boards and third-wave tasting notes, the coffee plant was just a shrubby little thing growing wild in the forests of East Africa with bitter red berries, unwanted, unbrewed, and totally unremarkable. Until humans got involved. But this is not the story of a comforting beverage. This is the story of a psychoactive plant that powered prayer, sparked revolutions, built empires, and, depending on where you're standing, either liberated thought or enslaved entire nations. I'm Megan Brame, and on this episode of The History of Plants, we're diving into Coffea arabica, a plant whose path runs from prehistoric forests to monastic rituals, from royal smuggling to global trade empires. And the strangest part? Coffee wasn't discovered. It was invented. But to understand how, we have to go back, not to a dancing goat herd, more on that later, but to millions of years before anyone knew what a bean was. Long before humans, language, or even the idea of mourning had any meaning, coffee was already adapting. The family it belongs to, Rubiaceae, had roots as far back as the late Cretaceous period. Fossil records suggest that this botanical line survived the extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs and gave rise to the genus Coffea. One distant relative, a fossilized fruit called Paleophytocrene chicoensis, was found near Sacramento dating to 80 million years ago. But the species we drink today, Coffea arabica, didn't arrive until much later. Arabica is a natural hybrid. It's a fusion between two wild ancestors, Coffea canephora, known today as robusta, and Coffea eugeneioides. That spontaneous genetic event likely happened in the Ethiopian highlands sometime between 610,000 and 1 million years ago. And there it stayed. For hundreds of thousands of years, Coffea arabica survived in the forests of southwestern Ethiopia and parts of South Sudan. It weathered dramatic climate shifts and population bottlenecks, including a near-extinction event between 20,000 and 100,000 years ago, when drought nearly erased the gene pool. According to genomic studies, every arabica plant cultivated today may descend from a single ancestor that lived between 10,000 to 20,000 years ago. The raw fruit, called a coffee cherry, has a tart, grassy flavor. Its seeds are bitter, hard, and honestly kind of gross until they're roasted. So while humans in East Africa surely encountered the plant, the big breakthrough wasn't finding it, it was figuring out what to do with it. Which brings us to the goats. According to one of coffee's most enduring legends, it was a 9th century European goat herd named Caldi who first noticed the magical bean. He saw his goats munching on bright red berries from a small tree and then began dancing, practically vibrating with energy. Curious, Caldi tried the berries himself, felt the rush, and brought them to a nearby monastery. As the story goes, the monks weren't thrilled to get this. They ended up tossing the berries into a fire, only to be stopped in their tracks by the smell. The roasted seeds gave off such an intoxicating aroma that the monks scooped them up from the embers, ground them, and mixed them with hot water. The result was a bitter black drink that helped them stay awake through hours of evening prayer. But I do have to tell you that this tale didn't appear in writing until the 1600s, and it likely originated in Europe and not Ethiopia. However, like all good myths, it reveals something true. Coffee's magic isn't in its fruit, it's what we do to it. Roasting, grinding, brewing, that's the alchemy. The monks may not have been the first to try it, but if the story is true, they could have been the first to give it purpose. Outside of the legend, what we do know is that real documented communities were discovering other ways to use the plant. The Oromo people of Ethiopia were likely among the first to tap into coffee's stimulant power. Long before it was brewed, it was chewed, often mixed with a fat into it like a kind of edible travel fuel. This method was less divine revelation and more practical energy boost for long journeys or battles. The first clear evidence we have of people actively cultivating coffee doesn't show up until the 9th century, and even then only in scattered regional traces. The earliest confirmed use of roasted and brewing coffee comes much later in 15th century Yemen, which means that while the plant had been quietly thriving in the forests of East Africa for nearly 1 million years, it took humans a very long time to recognize what they had. And when they finally did, it didn't begin in a lab or a market stall, but in a monastery, with a prayer, a cup, and a need to stay awake. And that brew that was allegedly created didn't just spark energy, it sparked a movement. The first people to brew coffee weren't royalty or merchants. They were actually Sufi mystics, which is a spiritual order within Islam known for their devotional rituals, poetry, and pursuit of divine connection through altered states of consciousness. If you've ever seen videos of dancers spinning in flowing robes, seemingly lost in trance, that's a form of Sufi worship. In the 15th century in Yemen, monks in remote highland monasteries began roasting coffee beans. Whether it was by accident or intention, the result was, I don't even know how to accurately give it the gravity it deserves. Transformative, let's say. They called the drink kawa, a word that once meant wine, but they didn't drink it for the taste. They drank it to stay awake during hours of prayers and chanting. The hard, bitter pit inside the coffee cherry, which is practically inedible, suddenly became fragrant, flavorful, and shockingly effective. Roasting didn't just make coffee palatable, it unlocked something hidden, a chemical surge of clarity that felt, for many, like communion. And it was that feeling, not the plant, not the ritual, that would soon sweep across empires. The port city of Al-Makka, known to the Europeans as Mocha, became ground zero for the world's first coffee trade. For nearly 2 centuries, Yemen maintained a strict monopoly, boiling or roasted every exported bean to prevent anyone else from growing it. Breaking that monopoly would eventually require espionage, smuggling, and seduction. But we'll get to that. For now, coffee remained a guarded treasure. It spread throughout the Islamic world, not by war or conquest, but by ritual and story and song. And if you like history meets botany and the kind of stories where plants reshape the world, now's the time to hit subscribe. By the early 16th century, coffee houses, known as kahvekhane, were appearing across cities like Mecca, Cairo, and Constantinople. But these weren't, quiet cafes. They were hubs of storytelling, poetry, politics. People gathered there to talk and debate, and just as in the monasteries, they came to stay awake. But not everyone loved this new energy. In 1511, the governor of Mecca declared coffee haram, forbidden, shutting down the city's coffee houses. The Ottomans followed suit in waves of suppression. Sultan Murad IV, who was known for disguising himself and patrolling the streets of Istanbul like some sort of ancient undercover boss, was said to personally behead anyone caught drinking the brew. But you can't stop it. It spread, because while coffee had once served the mystics, it now fueled a different kind of awakening for the poets and philosophers of Constantinople. One with ideas and revolutions and a dangerous new sense of public voice. These coffee houses had unlocked a world of ideas, the ability to talk with other people about revolutions, and brought about a dangerous, to some people, new sense of public voice. But coffee's true power wasn't just in what it inspired. It was in what it changed inside the brain, the bloodstream, and eventually the world economy. It didn't take long for European thinkers to fall for coffee, and not just as a curiosity, but as a revelation. In 1652, London got its first coffee house, founded by a Greek servant named Pasqua Rosé. They called them penny universities because 1 penny got you a cup, and 1 cup got you access to the ideas of the day. Like the kahvekhanes, these were not just hangouts. They became essentially newspapers, debate halls, business incubators, places where merchants made deals, philosophers swapped pamphlets and political satire, and even scientists examined everything from exotic plants to, according to one tale, dissected a dolphin, though that one's still up for debate. At Jonathan's Coffee House, traders set the prices that would eventually become the London Stock Exchange. At Lloyd's, merchants underwrote shipping ventures that stitched together the global economy. And at the center of this sober revolution was a drink that sharpened minds and kept you upright throughout hours of thought. But coffee's power didn't just come from culture. It came from its chemistry. The star molecule is caffeine, which is a natural stimulant that looks just like adenosine, the neurotransmitter that tells your brain it's time to rest. By impersonating it, caffeine slips into those receptors, blocking the signal to slow down. Your neurons fire faster. Your pituitary gland sounds the alarm. Your adrenal glands dump out the adrenaline. Heart rate climbs. Focus sharpens. You are awake whether you want to be or not. But caffeine's only the beginning. Coffee contains chlorogenic acids, which are powerful antioxidants that may help with inflammation and glucose metabolism. It also includes trigonylene, which breaks into niacin, or vitamin B3, during roasting and contributes to those earthy, sweet aromas. The compounds formed in the roasting process, called melanoidins, add body and color, and according to recent research, may actually help fight oxidative stress. And if you're drinking coffee from a French press or an unfiltered brew, you're getting cafestol and kaweol, 2 diterpenes that come with a trade-off. On the good side, they have antioxidant benefits, but on the bad side, they have the potential to raise LDL cholesterol. Current scientific studies say that most people can safely drink 3 to 4 cups per day, but like any drug, the dose matters. Too much, and that miracle brew becomes a menace. Jittery limbs, chest tightness, anxiety spirals, sleepless nights. The toxic threshold for caffeine in humans is about 10 grams in a short window, equivalent to about 70 to 100 cups of coffee. Realistically, you'd throw up long before you ever overdose from brewed coffee. But it's happened with supplements and powders. But in the 1600s, nobody knew that. They just knew that this bitter liquid could make you feel like a genius or break your brain if you weren't careful. And in a way, coffee didn't just stimulate thought, it tested restraint, because as Europe became hooked, the next step was inevitable. If a single port like mocha could become rich off a shrub, then what if the plant could be grown elsewhere? What happened next wasn't just plain commerce, it was espionage. By the 17th century, coffee was no longer just a ritual brew passed between mystics and scholars. It was becoming an obsession. The port of Mocha in Yemen had a lock on global supply. If you wanted coffee, you got it there and only there. But monopoly breeds temptation, and soon the world's rising powers decided they wouldn't just drink coffee, they'd steal it. One of the first breaches of the Arab monopoly is credited to Baba Budan, an Indian Sufi mystic. Around 1670, returning from his pilgrimage to Mecca, Baba Budan reportedly smuggled 7 fertile coffee beans out of Yemen. Some say he hid them in his beard, while others say he strapped them to his belly. Either way, he planted them in the hills of Karnataka, southern India, a region whose climate turned out to be perfect for coffee. Those 7 beans actually became the foundation of India's coffee industry. But that was just the beginning. In 1616, a Dutch trader named Peter van der Broeke managed to acquire live coffee plants from Yemen. The Dutch quickly planted them in their colonies, first in Sri Lanka and then Java. And it was in Java, not Mocha, that the plant truly took off. Within decades, Dutch-grown coffee had flooded European markets. It was so successful that Java became the synonym for the drink itself. And Yemen's once sacred crop was now a colonial commodity. And then came the French. In 1723, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu brought a single coffee seedling across the Atlantic to the island of Martinique. The ship was raided by pirates, battered by storms, and nearly becalmed, which, if you're unfamiliar, that's the condition where the ship is stuck at sea due to a lack of wind. When the crew's water rations were slashed, de Clieu reportedly shared his drinking water with the plant. It survived, and he survived, and when they landed, he planted the seedling. It thrived, becoming the genetic ancestor of most of the coffee grown in the Americas. Just a few years later, Brazil entered the story with a little bit of scandalous flair. In 1727, a Portuguese officer named Francisco de Melo Palheira was sent on a diplomatic mission to French Guiana. That was the cover, at least, but his real orders were to steal some coffee plants. According to legend, the French governor of Guiana, Pierre-Félix Barthélemy, refused to part with a single coffee plant, but his wife, Marie-Claude de Vic de Ponzibeau, proved to be more amenable. Whether it was diplomacy, charm, or something more personal, Palheira won her over during his stay. When he departed, she presented him with a lavish farewell bouquet, and within that bouquet, hidden among the flowers, carried the real prize: fertile coffee seedlings. From those smuggled plants, Brazil's coffee empire took off, eventually making it the largest producer in the world. All thanks, allegedly, to one man's diplomatic mission and one woman's well-timed gift. Over the next few decades, those seedlings multiplied, fueling an agricultural boom that would ripple far beyond Brazil's borders. By the dawn of the 19th century, the global map of coffee looked very different from the original Yemen stronghold. It was now dotted with plantations and shipping routes and monopolies and growing profits. But not everybody paid the same price for a cup. By the 1800s, coffee was no longer a sacred beverage brewed in monastic stillness. It was an international commodity, one that fueled empires, financed industry, and, for many, came with a brutal human cost. The rise of coffee plantations in the Americas, especially in Brazil and the Caribbean, depended almost entirely on enslaved African labor. European powers cleared forests, planted monocultures, and shipped millions of people across the Atlantic in chains. On these plantations, workers were forced to plant, tend, harvest, and process coffee under inhumane conditions. There was no relief in the shade of the coffee tree. There was only back-breaking labor and systemic violence. This was the paradox. A drink that came to represent freedom and enlightened thought and intellect in the West was built, in part, on systems of captivity and exploitation. While cafes in Europe buzzed with Enlightenment ideas and philosophical debate, the people growing the beans had no such liberties. As I mentioned earlier, Brazil became the largest coffee producer, supplying more than half of the global market by the mid-19th century. And it did so with enslaved labor until 1888, making it the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. These chapters of coffee's past don't erase its cultural value, but they do remind us that every global commodity carries a history, one that always isn't visible in the cup. And as the 20th century began, coffee was about to transform again, not in the fields, but in factories and cafes that would redefine how the world drank it. The first wave, the era of canned, vacuum-sealed convenience, dominated the early 1900s through the 1960s. Brands like Folgers and Maxwell House made coffee a kitchen staple, prioritizing shelf life and accessibility over origin or flavor. It was caffeine as utility, not experience. Then came the second wave, which brought the cafe back. Beginning in the 1970s and driven by chains like Starbucks, this movement reframed coffee as a lifestyle. Dark roasts, espresso drinks, and the idea of a cafe as a third place between work and home took hold. But even as it elevated the experience, it also standardized it, flattening flavor behind milk foam and branding. The third wave, which is still unfolding today, pushes back against that. It's a movement that treats coffee as a craft where origin, method, and story matter just as much as taste. Think single origin beans and pour-overs, or direct sourcing and lighter roasts. These all showcase the bean's natural character. Cafes became laboratories, baristas mad scientists. As an aside, in high school, I knew someone who eventually ended up going on to become like a competitive barista. It was just a world I had never heard about until he started doing it. And I have no idea what he's doing now. I think he's in politics. Anyways, suddenly coffee wasn't just a drink. It was a part of the conversation. But even with all this progress, many of the forces that once powered coffee's colonial rise, land control, labor inequity, monocultural farming, still exist today, just in subtler forms. The fungal disease known as coffee leaf rust is ravaging crops in Latin America and Africa. It attacks the plant's leaves, halting photosynthesis and leading to widespread crop loss. In some regions, yields have dropped by over 40%, forcing farmers to abandon their fields. And then there's climate change. Coffea arabica is notoriously picky, thriving only within narrow bands of altitude and temperature. As global conditions shift, those bands are moving or disappearing. Drought, erratic rainfall, and heat waves are reshaping where coffee can grow and whether it can grow at all. A report by the aptly named World Coffee Research estimates that half the land currently suitable for coffee could become unviable by 2050. For smaller farmers, adapting is expensive. Many can't afford the infrastructure, equipment, or new varieties needed to weather these changes. And even beans labeled fair trade or sustainable, which fetch premium prices in wealthier countries, often leave farmers with only a tiny fraction of the profits. Coffee's journey hasn't always been fair. But before you swear off your morning brew with existential guilt, know this, there is movement in the roots. In Latin America and East Africa, more farmers are turning to shade-grown and agroforestry practices, which are systems that interplant coffee with native trees to support biodiversity, conserve water, and buffer against extreme weather. In Honduras and Nicaragua, smallholders are adopting climate-resilient varieties like Starmaya and Centroamericano, which are hybrids developed to resist coffee leaf rust while maintaining yield and crop quality. Across Africa, projects like TechnoServe's Coffee Initiative have helped over 400,000 farmers improve their practices, earn certifications, and negotiate better prices through direct trade and cooperative models. And in Colombia, blockchain tools are helping growers track beans from farm to cafe, letting buyers verify sources and reward farmers for quality and sustainability. Look, it's not a perfect system, but it is evolving, and more of us, growers, roasters, and drinkers alike, are asking harder questions about where our coffee comes from and who it truly serves. Because even after a million-year journey, coffee is still adapting. We shaped the plant, but in many ways it shaped us too. I'm Megan Brame. Thank you for joining me on another episode of The History of Plants. You can check out the commentary episode on Patreon, or if you're craving another plant with a long, strange journey from ritual to routine, check out our episode on tea, a leaf that sparked empires, rebellions, and a few wars along the way. Until next time, greenies, stay curious, and don't forget to flourish.